Okay, look, I know. Every single LGBT book recommendation list has Giovanni's Room on it, but can you blame me? It's a good book, okay? It's good. In 1965, James Baldwin said in an interview, "Homosexual, bisexual, and heterosexual are 20th century terms, which, for me, have very little meaning." And such terms never show up in his most famous novel, Giovanni's Room. This is actually unusual for LGBT literature. Most books in this space have their characters unambiguously identify as what they are, and in my opinion, that's fine. It works. However, Baldwin has some thematic goals in this novel that the omission of clear identity labels points towards. The protagonist of Giovanni's Room, David, is caught in the center of a love triangle. On the one hand, David is all but engaged with a woman named Hella, whom, after he proposes marriage to her, takes some time away alone to think about the prospects of being David's wife before returning to him later to say yes. However, in the intervening time between David's proposal and Hella's return, David has been perusing the bars and clubs of Paris after dark and discovered a new love. One night, he goes home with a young bartender named Giovanni, and they begin a rapidly escalating romance. Eventually, Giovanni falls so in love with David that nothing else in his life keeps him from despair. David is caught between two romances, one with a man and one with a woman, and he cannot decide between them because of the implications that settling would have upon his identity. This is especially clear in his relationship with Giovanni. In fact, some masculine gay and bisexual guys out there might recognize this anxiety. David worries that his attraction to men undermines his masculinity, as defined for him by his patriarchal upbringing. He worries a lot about whether he's a proper man or not. His anxiety isn't helped by the fact that David is also an American living in Europe, and embracing Giovanni as a long-term partner would effectively mean cutting himself off from his home culture, which in the 50s was, very conservative. However, he also has anxieties about committing fully to Hella, because moving back to America and living as a comfortable heterosexual family man cut off from Europe and the LGBT community similarly feels as though he's alienating himself from a culture that he belongs to. If he marries Hella and returns to America, it's likely that he's never setting foot in a gay bar again, and probably won't be associating with any openly LGBT friends either, or at least during the 50s era. I personally found this particular anxiety to be, at least in part, authentic to my experience when exploring my own sexuality at a younger age. Bisexual and pansexual people can often face pressure from both heteronormative culture and gay culture to pick a side, as it were. However, the reason why bi and pan folk can't simply do this is because ascribing to identity labels is not only how you define who and what you are, but also how you define who and what you are not. David's anxiety and his unwillingness to commit fully to either partner is not simply a matter of him being unfaithful or unreliable, but because making a decision either way means cutting himself off from a culture he belongs to and therefore an essential part of his identity. The narrative simply frames the decision using the romantic relationships between David and his two lovers, creating a situation dripping with tension and interpersonal drama. Oh, but I feel the need to mention 100% of love triangles would be instantly resolved if we as a society would just embrace the idea of polyamory. Just saying. This bisexual conundrum is the central focus of this novel. David's circumstance is actually forcing him into the exact dilemma that bi and pan folk are often told they're supposed to be in. Pick a side, men or women, whichever you love more, or more enjoy having sex with. But of course, much like David's personal problems, it's more complicated than just love or sex. Perhaps contrary to how Baldwin would have preferred that I interpret his book, this story actually exemplified for me why it's important to be able to articulate your own identity on your own terms, so that you can decide who you want to be, but also who you want to not be. In David's fear of alienation, I can see why some people choose to don highly specific labels, and I can also see Baldwin's own distaste for them. Some people find certain labels empowering, others find them constraining. It comes down to the individual's preference, and it's not simply an internal act of self-actualization, because openly associating yourself with certain identities has ramifications for how other people treat you. In fact, much of the backdrop of this novel's setting, the gay bars and clubs of nighttime Paris, are described as being filled with closeted homosexual men who are living double lives, essentially trying to separate their sexuality from the personas that they perform during the daytime. This book is absolutely dripping with rich and intimate themes like that, but beyond simply introspecting upon David's personal identity crisis, it actually takes a step further and shows that a failure to resolve issues of identity can cascade outward and hurt not just the person facing the crisis, but those closest to them as well, which, without going into details, is also something I found in part authentic to my experience. Best of all, the novel doesn't absolve David from judgment over the selfish things he does to protect himself from isolation. David is a liar, and he hurts the people close to him because he's a coward. The novel is careful to frame David's circumstances sympathetically, and to also show that David himself handles them in an incredibly selfish and destructive way.
He stopped and sat down, staring at the wall. Then he turned to me. He watched me for a long time, in silence. Then, "If you were not here," he said, very slowly, "this would be the end of Giovanni." I stood up. "Don't be silly," I said. "It's not so tragic as all that." I paused. "Guillaume's disgusting. They all are. But it's not the worst thing that ever happened to you, is it?" "Maybe everything bad that happens to you makes you weaker," said Giovanni, as though he had not heard me. "And so you can stand less and less." Then, looking up at me, "No, the worst thing happened to me long ago, and my life has been awful since that day. You're not going to leave me, are you?" I laughed. "Of course not." I started shaking the broken glass off our blanket onto the floor. "I do not know what I would do if you left me." For the first time I felt the suggestion of a threat in his voice. Or I put it there. "I have been alone so long. I do not think I would be able to live if I had to be alone again." "You aren't alone now," I said, and then quickly, for I could not at that moment have endured his touch, "Shall we go for a walk? Come out of this room for a minute." I grinned and then cuffed him roughly, football fashion, on the neck. Then we clung together for an instant. I pushed him away. "I'll buy you a drink," I said. "And will you bring me home again?" he asked. "Yes, I'll bring you home again."
The writing style has a vividly illustrative use of metaphor and imagery. This is, without question, the best written book that I'm going to be featuring in this series by a country mile. James Baldwin has a command over the English language that you don't find from most other authors, and he has a number of stylistic choices so effective and yet so subtle that even avid readers may not notice them at first glance. As an example, the story of Giovanni is told using frame narrative, as David remembers the events of his affair. David in the frame is written using present tense, while David in the main story is written using past. Baldwin's writing here is so subtle and so seamless that I had a sense of the time frame of each scene even before I noticed that this was how he did it. It felt kind of like examining a rich and detailed oil painting from afar, and then zooming in to notice the details, which made me appreciate the effect of the whole even more when stepping back again. I also feel like I have to praise this novel's characterization. Despite being a relatively short novel, the reader gets to know David in particular to a depth that's quite remarkable. Part of that is due to the introspective nature of the novel, occasionally going deep enough that you could call it a character study. And Baldwin's writing is so dense with flavor and emotion that even short scenes or soliloquies are an outstanding exercise in getting to know this protagonist to the fullest. Giovanni is also incredibly well characterized. He has a fragile soul due to past traumas, about which he gradually opens up to David, and much of the tension in this novel is generated by knowing just how likely David is to fumble handling Giovanni's fragile heart given his own insecurities. All of the flat side characters also suit their roles perfectly. However, the only character I was a little disappointed by was Hella, who I feel wasn't given enough depth to make me fully appreciate the tension of her being romantically involved with David to the same extent as Giovanni. I got the sense that if David and Hella didn't work out, Hella would be heartbroken and disappointed. But I got the sense that if David and Giovanni didn't work out, Giovanni's life would be over. And I feel like if I had to criticize this novel for one thing, it's that Hella's relationship with David could have been given far more weight to Hella herself, rather than simply being mostly a personal identity problem for David. I just realized that I'm offering criticism to James Baldwin. Oh god, I've gone full YouTube reviewer. God, I'm gonna stop. For anyone interested in bisexual representation, characterization driven by sexuality and identity, or a meditative and psychological novella about love, commitment, and community, this one comes with a strong recommendation from me. I gave myself a rule for this series to not recommend the well-known classics of LGBT fiction, mostly because they don't need my recommendations. However, I still wanted to highlight Giovannis Room because if you're interested in LGBT literary classics, it's definitely the best place to begin if you want to dive into that space. Being a classic, this novel shouldn't be at all difficult to get a hold of. I found mine in a major bookstore chain in Melbourne, Australia. If you don't have a local bookstore that sells the novel, I've linked several online book retailers in the description that I recommend, such as Better World Books, Alibris, and Blackwell's. But please buy from a local independent retailer if possible, or consider loaning it from your local library. I hope you enjoyed this video or found it useful. I would appreciate it if you subscribed to my channel, clicked the like button, left a comment, help me grow the channel with engagement and algorithms and everything. Share it on social media. Send things to my email, I guess. Let me know if you enjoyed the novel, especially. Thanks for watching. Bye.